Always curious, Professor George Washington Carver committed his life to scholarship, community, and the integration of his Christian faith with higher education. It's in this spirit we welcome you to Carver Classrooms.
Welcome back to this Carver Classrooms course on poetry in the church. In this last session, I want to ask, why do we even bother with this art form of poetry, and what does it have to offer to the church? Hopefully by now you've begun reading around in the world of poetry and possibly sharing a poem or two with others. If not, don't worry. Poetry is there to be picked up whenever you have a chance. But why pick it up at all? And what does poetry offer to leaders in the church, but also to the Christians in the pew? I want to give 3 basic reasons for why we might want to read poetry. Now, poetry does all kinds of things, so this cannot begin to summarize what all poetry can do for us and for the world. But these 3 reasons get at a particular angle of what poetry can do for the church. The first thing is that poetry names creation. It participates in one of the very first tasks given to Adam, which is to name the world. Poetry is an art of naming. Second, poetry tells the truth, but it does so in a different sort of way. It understands the truth as experience, not just as a proposition or logic or a statement of fact. To know in poetry is to undergo. And finally, poetry helps us fulfill the calling of Romans 12:15, to weep with those who weep and to rejoice with those who rejoice. So first, creation and naming. In the creation stories that we get in Genesis 1 and 2, God brings every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens before Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. God invites us to participate in that same act of naming creation. Now, imagine, God could have pronounced a name for all of creation and required Adam to know its name and repeat it. He doesn't do that. He says to Adam, name this. Name it for yourself. Participate in the act of creation. And more than that, God delights in this task that he's given Adam. It's almost as if he is eager to see what Adam will do. He pulls up a chair. He leans in. He wants to see what Adam will call all of creation. We are invited to participate with God in the making of this reality through the naming of this reality. And that's why W.H. Auden and many others have called Adam a proto-poet. As the writer Tish Harrison Warren has said, we participate in Adam and Eve's vocation in the garden, the vocation of naming. We give words to reality, and through our words, we help shape reality. Poetry names. And to name things properly, it must pay attention. That's why I've often said that poetry is, in fact, the art of attention. We read poetry ourselves to help pay attention to the world that God has given us. Second, in the art of naming, poetry tells the truth. It names things that we must know. It tells us who we are, what we are, where we live, how we live. It names things like injustice, yes, but it also might name the ordinary things that we have failed to praise. It draws our attention to the world in a way that helps us understand the truth of the world, the truth of our relations in the world to one another and to God and to all of creation. So poetry tells the truth, but the mode of telling the truth often differs from what we usually understand by that. There's a great poem by Emily Dickinson called "Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant." And what she means in that poem is that poetry has to come at things on the slant, indirectly, so that we can begin to glimpse the reality that we too often ignore or overlook. So one way to understand this is to think about the way we ascend to the top of a mountain. If we're a hiker, we don't just go straight up a mountain. That's too difficult. We'll never get there. Instead, we switch back on ourselves. We cut around. We circle back. And this is the way that poetry often works. It takes us the long way around so that we can actually summit the peak. This idea is actually ancient. It's not new. This metaphor is not new to me. It comes from the great poet and priest John Donne. And this is what he says about truth. On a huge hill, cragged and steep, truth stands. And he that will reach her, about must go. And what the hill's suddenness resists, wins so. What I love about this little piece of poetry about truth is that it is itself indirect. It winds itself around and around until it comes to the conclusion with those two simple words, wins so. That's so often how poetry works. The indirectness of so much poetry responds to reality itself. As James K.A. Smith writes, the creator of the cosmos comes at us slant. He shows up in a way that also hides. Poetry often comes at the truth slant, so that we can reach it, so that we can see reality for what it is. In doing that, poetry enables us to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. I remember a lesson from a sermon I had when I was a kid. This is like 30 years ago. Very seldom do we remember sermons that we had as a kid 30 years ago. But in this case, it reoriented the way that I read the Psalms. My pastor told me something that seems pretty obvious. The Psalms are not about me. As a 14-year-old kid, or however old I was, I thought the whole world was about me. So this really was shocking to me. But what he said was the poems are the experiences of the church. And what we ought to do is begin at the beginning and read a different psalm every day to know the experiences of the church, not so that we can ventriloquize our own experiences, but so that we can weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. Each poem is voicing the experience of some Christian somewhere in the world right now, and we can at least begin to sympathize with them and pray for that person, even if this is not our own experiences at the time. So, the Psalms can be reimagined as the voice of someone, somewhere, with whom I should sympathize or pray. But poetry of all sorts does that for us. I remember as a graduate student, I used to teach poetry in med school at the Northwestern Medical School. And these are all future doctors and nurses. These are not people who typically read poems or love to read poetry. And so they were very skeptical of my entire course. But early on in the course, I gave them this book called Without by the great poet Donald Hall. And this is a poem about the dying of his wife, Jane Kenyon, who was a great Christian poet herself. She died of cancer. And I said, take this book of poetry, which is less than 100 pages, and read it cover to cover. Don't stop. And 201, they came back to that class and they said to me, I didn't know poetry could be like this. I didn't know it could be moving like this. I didn't know that it could be understood like this. I didn't know it could be plain like this. They came to see poetry in a whole new light. Now, we can read Donald Hall's poetry, but we can also read Jane Kenyon's poetry. As a Christian, she faced her own death, and she wrote a whole bunch of poems that have a wide variety of experiences and approaches to that coming death. And the poems are incredible. I recommend them to you. So these are the kinds of poems that enable us to weep with those who weep. And that kind of weeping can take any number of forms, whether it's the approach of death, whether it's an injustice that has failed to be righted. Whatever it might be, we can begin to experience what others undergo. Poetry enables the church to expand. It enables the church to know by undergoing. In the same way, poetry enables us to rejoice with those who rejoice. And sometimes the rejoicing might take a form we wouldn't recognize. So it should not be too much of a surprise to those who are watching this video that I come from a white church and a white church background. And yet, one of the great Easter poems that I love comes out of the black church tradition. And what it seems to describe is a huge feast, a huge celebration. But it's the last line of this poem by Lucille Clifton that really reminds me of what it means to rejoice. It's the last line that turns from Christ to the possibilities that Christ opens up in the resurrection itself. So here's the poem. It's a poem called Spring Song by Lucille Clifton. The green of Jesus is breaking the ground, and the sweet smell of delicious Jesus is opening the house, and the dance of Jesus' music has hold of the air, and the world is turning in the body of Jesus, and the future is possible. Now, if you tell my own kids that the future is possible, they might look at you a little funny. They might think, of course the future is possible. We never thought otherwise. But in a whole lot of context, to tell somebody that the future is possible is deeply moving. It means reorienting their sense of what the future might hold. One of the pastors of one of my former churches had formerly preached in Sandtown in Baltimore in very difficult circumstances. And I remember him preaching a sermon in our church in which he said, look, when I preach about the coming judgment in a suburban, wealthy, white church, people tend to squirm a little bit. They get a little bit uncomfortable. They think, yeah, we want the coming judgment. We want the end times. Sure, we want Jesus to return, but just maybe not yet. He says, when I preach this same sermon in Sandtown and other places like that, people say, hallelujah, amen, how soon? He says, this gives you a sense of the differences between neighborhoods and how they respond to the biblical message. But he also said, a poem like this, The Future is Possible, suggests to us the different ways that people understand their own future. In a place like Sandtown, he said, hope dies young. People do not expect to live past 25, or at least they expect to be either in jail or dead by the age of 25. Now, if that's the world in which you live, if that's what the future holds for you, then to be told through the resurrection that the future is possible is a way to rejoice in a wholly different way than you had before. So when I say rejoice with those who rejoice, I mean that poetry opens us up to the possibility of understanding the world in a whole new way, not just my rejoicing, but what does rejoicing mean to somebody else in entirely different circumstances? Poetry brings us in to the experiences of others. We know by undergoing, we weep with those who weep, we rejoice with those who rejoice. So these are a few things that poetry can do for us and for the church. Poetry names creation, poetry tells the truth, and poetry can help us weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. It's there for us to pick up whenever we want to take it and read. So I hope this course has taught us a few things about why we might want to read poetry and how we might begin to do so. Poetry has so much to offer the church, but the main thing it teaches us is that human beings are both body and soul. And poetry is an art that is aimed at experience, that understands us as embodied creatures. In poetry, to know is to undergo. There is a reason that God delights in poetry, and he invites us to do the same. I hope you enjoyed this Carver Classrooms course on poetry and the church. If you did, there are others to check out online, and those who are drawn to this one might in particular like John Hendricks's course on art and the church. Thank you so much for watching.